the groups and everything like that we heard. Democrats and Republicans have not done the job as they should. But the children are listening. And the first people they listen to are their parents. Listen to what Mr. Kelly said. The parents, us. A wink and a blink gets you by sometimes, but it causes a tremendous amount of damage. Tens of millions of Americans have been shocked, disgusted by the anti-Semitic poison we have seen in college campuses. The displays of many of these campuses are a disgrace. Administrators, faculty at some of these schools have fostered environments of intolerance, ignorance, and cruelty in the name of free speech. In the name of free speech. No, we're not going to solve this by law, but if we quiet and we don't speak up our minds and are not afraid to stand even when the crowd may not be with us, it's easy to talk to everybody who agrees with us. We're in bad shape, worse shape than I thought. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that this be an ongoing situation until not only we cool the waters, but we see progress on the campuses, so that we define what free speech is and what it is not. And when I'm on a campus to learn, and I don't feel comfortable even to go to class, that's horrific. And I will not tolerate it as a legislator, so get rid of me then. Try. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I hope we have another one soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Steele is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you for all the witnesses coming in. I'm not here to lecture you because you know more than I do about anti-Semitism and what's going on with the campus, but we must ensure that schools are fulfilling their educational purpose as required to maintain tax-exempt status under the law. But Professor Davidai just said that, just take that tax-exempt status away. I don't think that's enough because we have to do more than that. So my bill, the Deterrent Act, would add transparency, accountability, and clarity to colleges and universities and hold them accountable for foreign funds they receive, and I hope that Senate will pass it immediately because we see that Qatar, pro-Hamas Hamas countries that, they are actually pouring money in, hundreds of millions of dollars to these universities. When we had a hearing at the Education Committee, I asked those university presidents, they're the one raising funds for their universities, and I asked them that how much you received the money from Qatar. They decided not to answer. Actually, they said they're gonna come back to us. But you know what, we didn't get any answers because they all resigned from their positions. So I really wanna see that how much we really pour money into brainwashing our students. Just brainwashing, you know what, we have to teach our kids how to think instead of just brainwashing and spreading these propagandas. So we really have to change these campuses. And another thing is when we actually take tax money away, it's not, as of now, actually, it's not even going to the classes or professors. It goes to the administration. We have these prominent universities has much, much bigger administration than actually this money going into the classrooms. So we have to really watch out that how much is really going to the classrooms and students, that we really have to change that. So Mr. Marcus, when students are assaulted during campus events, because I just saw that, I think you all did too on the video, UCLA is one of the prominent college. I didn't go there. I went to USC, so it's, I think USC is much better school than UCLA. But having said that, one of the Jewish students at UCLA was kicked in the face. They took his yarmulke off, and this anti-Israel protester during a pro-Palestinian encampment, that this protester was chasing him with the taser. It should not happen on the campus. So, do you think it's a good indicator that schools are fulfilling their educational purpose as required by law, and what we have to do? I think I'm asking Mr. Marcus about this.
Well, Congresswoman Steele, I think that it's fair to say that when students are assaulted in that way, they are prevented from enjoying an equal opportunity to an education, no question about it. I would also say that on many campuses, there is a permissiveness towards masked students. And then the university said, well, what can we do about it? We can't identify the perpetrator. Well, they don't have to permit the masks in the first place, and they certainly can take action after it happens, if not also before. Yes, indeed.
How about those that UCLA had a mandatory meeting that lecturer led the students in a free Palestine chant? I don't know you guys all read or you guys all watched or not, but Mr. Marcus, based on what you've seen, can you speak to the role that radical faculty like this play in the anti-Semitism occurring across the college campuses?
Look, there are good faculty and not good faculty, but too often we're seeing faculty members who are promoting this in a lot of different ways. There's been discussion today about faculty members who actually join in bigoted protest activities. But even beyond that, there are faculty members who encourage it through their teaching, through the doctrines they adopt, through the ways in which they use the bully pulpit, as it were, to spread hate towards the Jewish people, towards Israeli Americans and others. We could look at all of the new policies we would like from administration, but as long as faculty are fomenting this hate, we're really not going to solve the problem.
Dr. Pidluzny, if I pronounced it right, if I didn't do it, I'm sorry. I understand that you have written about this previously, that about what are your thoughts on what schools could do better combat the rise of anti-Semitism on their campuses and the role that radical faculty are playing in it?
Thank you for the question, and I applaud the Deterrent Act. Thank you for all that work. I think we know from empirical research that universities with pro-BDS, anti-Zionist faculty see higher levels of student-on-student harassment, and we know that those faculty are funded by foreign entities. So I would say the first thing that they should do is they should audit their foreign gifts. That's one thing that OCR should ask universities to do as it starts to reach some settlement agreements. Audit your foreign gifts and disclose their purpose to the Department of Education. Another thing that I think they could do is audit their academic programs. Is there intense anti-Israel bias in public affairs? If there is intense intellectual bias in public affairs disciplines, bring viewpoint diversity to those disciplines so that students hear two sides.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. Since this committee met in December of last year, not only has anti-Semitism on college campuses grown worse, it has also morphed into anti-American rhetoric as well. And several institutions that we've heard today have placated the mob of violent protesters who have terrorized Jewish students. And we all worry, I think, about what the situation will look like when classes resume at the end of the summer. At an earlier hearing, I'd asked about the impact of foreign money from adversarial nations or nations that don't have our own interest in mind, the impact of that money on domestic higher education system. For example, Qatar has contributed $4.7 billion to U.S. academic institutions from 2001 to 2021. It's the same country that harbors leaders of Hamas in Doha, finances Hamas, and blamed Israel for the October 7th attacks. The University of Pennsylvania, in my state, received $130 million in donations from China from 2018 to 2023, including from individuals with ties to the CCP. And of course, that's the same CCP which has falsely accused Israel of being an oppressor nation and took the side of South Africa in calling Israel's response to the October 7 terror attacks a genocide. Mr. Pidluzny, and I hope I got the name close to right, most higher education institutions are tax-exempt organizations under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. This was discussed briefly, but when this section of the tax code was created, do you believe it was intended to be leveraged by foreign governments?
Absolutely not. You know, I said a moment ago, I think you may have not been in the room, that the university's tax-exempt status is based on their being organized and operated exclusively for educational purposes. I think if you go back 50 years, that probably is true of the vast majority of universities. They take educating very seriously. Today, you know, I'm in the habit of recommending that young people don't go to an elite university, as when I was a university professor, or that they don't go to an R1 research university, because the faculty are in their labs doing research, they're mentoring their graduate students, and they aren't interested in undergraduate education. So today, our university systems, or our multiversities, they are not focused on education, right? They are focused on disseminating an ideology, right? Administrative spending is through the roof. Some universities have more administrators than they have undergraduates.
So you would agree that it certainly is not within the spirit of the law for foreign governments to directly or indirectly promote their agendas at colleges and universities?
Of course not. You know, the New York Times.
Do you think, and I'm sorry, I just don't have a lot of time, do you think these institutions that receive foreign donations should be subject to taxes on those donations?
I think that's an idea worth exploring, because the only way to change behavior will be financial levers.
Do you know if foreign universities, just by comparison, do they accept donations or grants from American citizens, institutions, or the federal government?
That's not something I've studied.
Yeah, and I wonder if they do, how do foreign countries regulate or monitor those grants? Do you have any, do you know at all?
I'm not aware, no.
Mr. Marcus, you've seen how the Education Department has failed at properly enforcing Title VI. Do you believe that foreign donations which fund certain faculty fellowships or departmental chairs have influenced the curriculum at these institutions?
Foreign governments and foreign entities are pumping a large amount of money into U.S. universities, and it's hard to imagine that it is having no influence, and particularly no deleterious influence. At the same time, I would have to say that we're doing a weak job on our own, particularly when it comes to our elementary and secondary schools, which are now themselves also a source of anti-Semitism, which then creates worse problems in higher education.
Sure. What transparency do we have now, or what could we do to ensure that there is transparency around these foreign grants which potentially shape the school curriculum?
We do have rules that require disclosure of foreign contributions to U.S. universities, but weak enforcement systems and little in the way of penalties when they fail to do so. As a result, there has been widespread failure to report over the years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I don't think we can discuss the issues enough that we are discussing now. I want to thank all of the witnesses for the care and attention that you have given to your responses and to your positions. As I listen to the discussion, I'm reminded of something that President John Kennedy said one time discussing peace. And he said that peace is not only found in treaties, covenants, and charters, but in the hearts of men. And I guess if he was alive, he probably would say the hearts of men and women. So I think we look for many places for answers and solutions. It's so good to see you, Ted, and I'm very interested in the work that you are doing. And I assume that the purpose of our hearing is to try and reduce anti-Semitism, reduce the rise, reduce discrimination, reduce hatred, reduce all of those negative things that we are saying exist on college campuses. And I guess not only on college campuses, because they exist in many other places, many other organizational entities, and all of the places where people do business. Representative Deutch, let me ask you, because I think if we take or if we allow ourselves to take a deeper dive into the history of our nation, the history of our Constitution, the history of how America got to be the America that it is, that many people would have different levels of understanding and different views. So my first question to you is, do you think if we studied history more in our elementary and high schools, or leading up to college campuses, that by the time individuals get there, their views may be different than some of what is being expressed?
Representative Davis, thank you. It's good to see you as well. The answer to that is absolutely yes. The challenge, and Mr. Marcus just alluded to this, the challenge is that now in too many elementary and middle and high schools, we've seen, just as we're seeing on college campuses, we're seeing an attempt to erase the Jewish contribution in America, to specifically exclude the Jewish community, to refuse to acknowledge the existence of anti-Semitism. And the problem, I want to make one point, Congressman Davis, that's not been made because it should be obvious. The reason all of this, the reason that everything that Professor Davidai has experienced is so relevant to everything we're discussing. Our own survey shows that over 80% of American Jews, over 80%, say that caring about Israel is important to what being Jewish means to them. With that understanding, Congressman Davis, yes, we need people to better understand the facts about the Jewish community, the facts about Israel, the facts about the history of anti-Semitism that did not start on October 8th, that for millennia, this is what we've been battling, what that means and why we have to combat it.
You mentioned the need for mandatory anti-Semitism training. Are there examples of
Yes. Sure. AJC has provided training for both high schools and, importantly, universities around the country who will, when they acknowledge the problem on their campus, will come in and provide training to the president and his or her senior staff, or to all of the faculty, or best case, to the entire university community, to help them understand what anti-Semitism is, what the Jewish community is, to help break down the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that so many people aren't even aware that they're using, and to help them understand why anti-Zionism that says that the only state in the world that has no right to exist is the Jewish state has the impact that it does on the Jewish community when you say it, particularly when the way that you say it is to call for death to Zionists.
So we need to do as much in the way of educating as we do trying to change our rules and laws and all of those other things as well. And one is probably as good as the other.
We need to educate, and even as the august members of this committee talk about potential changes to the law, the opportunity right now to go to all of your local universities, all of the universities in the country, and ask the presidents, it's now the middle of June, what are you doing to prepare for what is likely to occur and the threats that will exist for Jewish students when they return in the fall? Now is the time for them to prepare those plans and to share them with the community and with the country.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Congressman, thanks for being here. There are many Jewish families and organizations in my district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who are integral to our community. My district also has a large evangelical population that prays for the peace of Jerusalem, and I'm proud to be one of those. We also have the Sherwin Miller Museum, which hosts a sobering exhibit educating, as you just mentioned, citizens on the realities of the Holocaust. Understanding and remembering history is important if we wish to avoid repeating the horrors of the past, just as my colleague from Illinois just mentioned. Every American should be outraged by what we're seeing across the country. These demonstrations are pro-terrorism and anti-American and should be universally condemned. This isn't just about expression, it's a dangerous endorsement of violence on American soil. It's alarming. Protesters scaling buildings, waving terrorist propaganda, repeating slogans rooted in hatred, barring Jews from entering buildings, holding janitors captive. This isn't activism, it's extremism, borderline terrorism. It's deeply troubling to see the lack of moral clarity in university leaders who refuse to condemn anti-Semitic demonstrations on campuses. It's a sad day in America when parents at school board meetings are deemed terrorists, but Hamas's brutal violence against women and children is defended, even celebrated on our campuses across America. Unfortunately, this confusion and chaos at higher institutions of higher ed is not an anomaly. For decades, prestigious colleges have slowly soiled their reputations by embracing Marxism, Confucius institutes, and moral relativism at the expense of merit, virtue, and truth. Education is no longer the mission. Whether intentionally or not, this is stupidity. Universities have allowed radical ideologies, often funded by the Chinese Communist Party, to indoctrinate our students. Universities have strayed from their academic mission in pursuit of DEI, teaching students to make judgments of people based on race, gender, and sexual identity instead of teaching students to respect every person as an individual with dignity and inherent worth. All is not lost, though. In the face of blatant hatred and anti-Semitism, millions of Americans of all races and religions have shown support, love, and kindness to our Jewish friends and neighbors. Support for Hamas is support for terrorism, plain and simple. Organizations that funnel money to terrorists or take money from known terrorist organizations should not hold tax-exempt status. As members of this Ways and Means Committee, we hold the power of the purse and tax-exempt status. With that power comes great responsibility to provide oversight on charities and universities that potentially abuse their tax-exempt status. American universities continue to receive billions of dollars in the form of taxpayer subsidies, tax breaks, and federal payments, yet anti-Semitic incidences increase on our campus. Higher ed should not continue to receive taxpayer money in the form of federal payments, grants, or tax exemptions if they continue to turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism on their campuses. Dr. Pidluzny, I understand you've written extensively about DEI efforts on college campuses, particularly about how these efforts fundamentally alter the course of institutions' academic mission. These are the same institutions that receive billions of taxpayer dollars each year through the tax-exempt status. Do you believe these institutions who either implement DEI policies or promote anti-Semitism are worthy of taxpayer dollars? Should American taxpayers be forced to subsidize this institutional hatred?
Not if they continue once they're warned. So I think universities need to be on warning that this is something this committee is looking at. I'd also like to say a little bit about how profoundly DEI has reshaped these institutions. We're talking about an investment of $25 to $35 million at large universities, like University of Texas System or University of Florida System or Berkeley. That's $250 million over a decade, right? That allows an army of activists to incorporate DEI screens into hiring processes, into tenure policies. They create mandatory trainings that teach young people to make snap judgments about each other based on race stereotypes. race exclusionary graduations, bias response teams, forbidden word lists, new curriculum. Right? This has profoundly transformed our institutions.
Thank you. Mr. Marcus, can you tell us what role you've seen DEI programs play in the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses?
Congressman Hearn, I've seen a mixed bag. In candor, we have seen some students who say that the DEI offices have been a help to them when they face anti-Semitism. We've seen many who say that it is not helpful to them. And we have seen some who will say that it is a problem for a few reasons. First, because DEI offices in so many cases fail to even recognize that Jewish students exist or that anti-Semitism is a problem. Second, because they too often have this notion of oppressors and oppressed with nothing in between, and that sort of simplicity isn't helpful. And third, because once they make that division, they too often say, well, Jews are not among the oppressed, they're among the oppressors, and they fall back on stereotypes that are harmful both to Jews and everyone else.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Kustoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. And Mr. Marcus, if I could with you, and I want to follow up on some line of questioning that Congressman Smucker and Hearn have asked about. In fact, I just looked up, it's been 250 days since the October 7th attacks, which in some ways it seems like longer, in some ways it seems like yesterday, I think, to everybody. This past weekend, with the hostages rescue, by the way, they weren't released, as some news organizations said, they were rescued bravely. But we learned that a quote-unquote journalist who was working for the Palestine Chronicle was holding Israeli hostages in his home in Gaza. 3 of the 4 that were released was held by him. And I do want to remind people that the Palestine Chronicle is part of the People Media Project, which is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization based in the United States of America. So I bring all that up. Congressman Snyder and I co-sponsored a bill, H.R. 6408. It's a bill to revoke the tax-exempt status of any nonprofit that provides keywords material support to a designated terrorist group. And I will tell you that I'm proud that this committee passed that bill out of this committee by a vote of 41-0. You know the partisan nature of Washington, that says something. I'm also very proud that the entire body, the entire House of Representatives, passed that bill on April the 15th of this year by a vote of 382-11. Again, a very strong vote. My point is this, and I'm coming to my question in just a moment. I think if we want to disrupt the financing behind terrorist and extremist anti-Semitism, we've got to know where the money's coming from in the first place. Now, in your testimony, certainly in your written testimony, you talk about the DOJ investigating. You talk about OCR investigating. So my question to you is, what tools do they have to investigate, to show that from a reporting standpoint or compliance, that it's being done? And then secondly, if I can, from your standpoint, has the Biden administration used the tools that they've got with DOJ or OCR to investigate and go to the root of the funding?
So, Congressman Kustoff, we've not seen the full array of tools being used by any means. Some tools, yes, but certainly not all. During the prior administration, we saw investigations of undisclosed foreign funding in violation of federal law. More of that would be useful. We are seeing some actions by OCR, some by DOJ, but certainly not the sort of joint initiatives that those two departments used in prior administrations. Certainly not the sort of show of combined force on college campuses that would send a signal. So I would say that there remain unused tools that are available that should be handled but aren't.
Let me, if I can, may I ask a question a different way, maybe a different way than Mr. Smucker and Mr. Hearn asked. In terms of higher education, you're formerly an administration official with the Department of Education. Do you have any recommendations on how we can increase the transparency of the foreign funding as it relates to higher education?
Congressman Kustoff, if you were to increase the penalties for noncompliance, if you were to increase the enforcement over noncompliance, if you were to lower the threshold for disclosure requirements, in any of those instances, I think you would have much greater transparency.
Thank you. I thank you. I thank all the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to the witnesses for being here. Your testimony is very helpful and I think comes at a critical moment. Congratulations to Ms. Dror. It's good to see you again. Congratulations on your graduation. It's particularly good to see my friend, our former colleague, Congressman Ted Deutch, a fellow University of Michigan alum, I will note. Thanks for the great work you're doing. Look, I think it's clear anti-Semitism has no place in our communities and absolutely has no place on college campuses or universities. All across the nation, we are seeing acts of anti-Semitism on the rise. The Anti-Defamation League has reported large upticks in these threats, verbal and written harassment, and anti-Semitic acts. And let's be crystal clear. We're not talking about the right to protest. We're not talking about the right to disagree. We're not even talking about acts of civil disobedience as we know them to be important elements of public disagreement in this country. What we're talking about is hate speech that has a consequence, instills fear in people, leads to acts of violence. Just 2 weeks ago, as an example, I mentioned the University of Michigan. A good friend of mine, a regent, an elected regent at the University of Michigan, Jordan Acker, who happens to be Jewish, had his law office vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti. Acts like this are completely unacceptable and can't become normalized. That's why hearings like this are important, to put it on the record, to make it clear that the right to disagree cannot be conflated with hate speech that has a consequence and degrades the quality of our society. So I am happy to see some action. I'm happy that the Biden administration are taking actions to address much of this. Ongoing engagement with Homeland Security, Department of Justice, state and local law enforcement, that's important. But speaking out on anti-Semitism is not and should never become a political or partisan issue. And there are some who will try to take this moment to weaponize it for political purposes. Like most Americans, we can't tolerate that. We all struggle to try to make sense of the acts that we've seen take place, starting with the horrific attack by Hamas on Israel on October 7th, the fact that hostages continue to be held, and for some, obviously myself included, the thousands and thousands of innocent lives that have been lost in the course of this war. As an elected official, as a citizen, as a father, as a human being, we have to mourn all of those losses, but we can't allow that pain to translate to more pain and more hate. So let me ask Congressman Deutch, if you might, from your perspective, obviously we see anti-Semitism as a serious threat. Where in our society, I mean, we're talking a lot about campuses, but where are we seeing the largest
rise in this sort of anti-Semitism? Where in our society?
Well, we're seeing, and this gets exactly to the comments you just made, Congressman Kildee, there is a refusal to understand, to acknowledge the facts that we're dealing with at this moment. The fact that there are 120 hostages still remaining. The fact that, yes, we mourn the loss of every civilian life. As human beings, of course we do that. But there's a refusal to acknowledge that the reason that those lives are at risk is because Hamas will not return the hostages and lay down its arms. That Israel is defending itself after the worst terror attack, the worst attack against the Jewish community since the Holocaust. And where are you seeing this dramatic increase? You saw it on the streets of New York. You saw it in the streets of Washington just last weekend. You see it by those who are not protesting the policies of an Israeli government. They're celebrating the atrocities of a terror organization. They show up wearing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad headbands. They talk about killing Zionists. 1,000 more, 10,000 more October 7th. That's where we're seeing this dangerous spike. It's why universities, why this hearing is so important. It's why universities need to be clear about what they're going to do to hold people accountable when the students come back in the fall. This is not a partisan issue, and I appreciate your saying that. And just finally, one other way to get at this, the other piece of legislation that was referenced earlier, the Combating Anti-Semitism Act, is a bipartisan bill. Equal number of Democrats and Republicans on it, co-sponsored by introduced by the co-chairs of the bipartisan task force to combat anti-Semitism, and would specifically address all of this anti-Semitism by having an ongoing effort in the White House and at the Department of Education. I really encourage, again, in the true spirit of bipartisanship, which is on such full display here, which is so gratifying for me in my new role running a fiercely nonpartisan organization, I would encourage members to take a look at that as well. And I thank very much, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Jason, you look different.
It looks good in the chair. The chair recognizes Representative Estes for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. And Congressman Deutch, thank you. Good seeing you again, coming back. You know, the anti-Semitic activities that have occurred on college campuses are absolutely appalling. Our institutions of higher education should be beacons of hope in this country, where students seek reason, truth, and an education to help them with their life and whether it's a career or personal life. Instead, we see disruption and unruly students, faculty, administration, and in some cases outside provocateurs siding with a terrorist organization and chanting death to Israel while forcing Jewish students to fear and hide, unable to fully benefit from the college education they are paying for. When you think about the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, it's really unfathomable that anyone in the country would stand up and carry the flag of terror and hate openly onto a college campus and face no repercussions. Unfortunately, this didn't happen overnight. While the horrendous attacks on October 7th may have brought this to the forefront, anti-Semitic activity has been a growing problem as foreign bad actors have been funneling money onto our nonprofit colleges and universities to shape and influence these institutions to promote a distorted worldview that is downright anti-American. Today, we're seeing the effects of the millions of foreign dollars from anti-Israel and anti-American countries and organizations that have pumped into our institutions, and it's a horrible consequence that we're reviewing now. Our tax code and its treatment of college endowments shouldn't help foster these kind of anti-Semitic activities that have ravaged college campuses across the country. Mr. Pidluzny, Ways and Means Republicans have sought to hold America's so-called elite universities accountable for permitting and promoting anti-Semitic behavior on their campuses while allowing Jewish students to be threatened, harassed, and assaulted. One mechanism in the committee's jurisdiction is the endowment tax, first established under the Trump tax cuts in 2017. Do you think that structure of the endowment tax should be revised in light of the anti-Semitic activity on certain college campuses?
Absolutely. The universities need new accountability structures because the existing structures have proven inadequate. if you just look at private universities with endowments above $100,000 per student, the value of those endowments is over $500 billion. If you look at the 12 largest private endowments, 11 of those schools are the schools that we've seen in the news. The only thing that will change the behavior of our so-called elite universities is financial penalties for tolerating this.
You know, as you mentioned, both in your prepared remarks and in just the comments just now as well, that the current endowment tax, as is set up, affects private colleges and institutions that have an endowment value over $500,000. And it applies to roughly 35 schools that on any given year. And as you mentioned, 11 of the 12 top universities were very prevalent in having disruptions or protests and attacks. Do you think it's a coincidence that there's a relationship between the amount of money that they have and their tax status, and what's the connection and how can we address that?
I think the connection between the money and the grotesque anti-Semitism is that universities that are this wealthy can waste a lot, and administrators, they are used to giving into the radical DEI left, right? And as we've discussed in this hearing, the DEI that we're concerned about is the DEI that teaches students to make snap judgment based on identity characteristics. And the only way that they can account for the success of Jews in America and the state of Israel is to turn the state of Israel into the oppressor. And that makes, of course, the Hamas the virtuous victim. Right? So I do think there's a relationship, right? The wealth allows for these institutions to waste money building up these DEI apparatuses.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a critical conversation that we need to continue to having and to kind of seek out the root of, you might call it a plague or a disease that's affecting so many of our college campuses and make sure that we address it, maintain their status as good institutions for higher learning for the students that go there and the money that's spent by the students, by their parents, by taxpayers in terms of supporting them. So I appreciate your time for this hearing, and with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Representative Tinney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to this really all-star panel and all that so many of you have done on this really horrific issue. There's so many places to go, and I'm not sure where to start, but I want to just say in nearby Cornell University, my dad is a graduate of Cornell Law School back in the 50s. It was certainly not like it is today. Went on to serve as a trial lawyer and a judge, one of the longest-serving Supreme Court justices in New York. He would be absolutely horrified at what's happening at Cornell University. And I keep hearing, I see these protesters, as we all do as members of Congress, and thank you also to former Congressman Deutch for being here and being a leader on this issue as well. We're confronted with people at our doors, and we need to get the truth out. And I think the truth is what really these universities are about. Almost every one of these colleges has Veritas somewhere in their motto, including my own university, Colgate University in upstate New York. But my concern is, how do we get this truth out? And I think I'd like to ask Ms. Dror, and congratulations and thank you for being in the breach during this really difficult time on campuses. Tell us a little bit about what happened to you, as a college student on a campus where we had a professor just days after this horrific attack, Professor Rickford actually described the acts of Hamas as exhilarating and inspiring to Cornell students. And I watched the GoPro video that we were all allowed to see as members of Congress that were on Hamas terrorists' heads and their videos. And it was about a 45-minute montage. I could get to about 20 minutes. I almost think I don't like bad movies or anything, but this was the worst thing I think I've ever seen in my entire life. It was horrible. And we have protesters and people coming to our office telling us that this is not true. And I want to just get your view as a college student and what you witnessed on the college campus. I immediately called right after October 7th for the dismissal of Mr. Bickford. I did get a response from the president, President Pollock at the time. They did put him on leave, but I'm sure he's still making money on paid leave. I know it's not his full salary, but and when I get done with you, I want to ask Mr. Pidluzny about your discussion about the endowments and the money and the exemptions at these college campuses. So if you could tell us briefly just your experience and what is being done at Cornell to try to bring us back to the truth and to try to keep, the honesty in our college campus.
Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, Professor Rickford will be teaching again next semester after his paid leave is over. But I think you alluded to something very important, and if you'll indulge me, I do want to tell a quick story. The foreign funding entering our universities are incredibly concerning. Cornell gets $1.8 billion, capital B billion dollars from Qatar, an adversary of the United States. In December, I was able to have a meeting with Cornell's CFO in which I asked him, Cornell gets $1.8 billion from Qatar. There must be strings attached because there is no such a thing as a free lunch. So what's the string attached to your money? He can give me a really direct answer. But then I asked him, Mr. Cowan, what should I be telling my community right now? The Jewish community on campus is hurting. It was a month after we had received the blatant death threats. I said, what should I tell my community? He said, you should tell your community that that girl that testified in Congress, well, she's only one person. And we have 17,000 students. I wonder if he knew who he was talking to, because the girl he was referring to was me. And I wonder if he knew that 7 months later, I would say his name into the microphone and show that that first question that Chairman Smith asked in his most recent letter to administrators of whether or not they believe anti-Semitism is actually present on their campus, they might say yes, but the answer is no. Because in that moment, he invalidated my suffering as a Jewish student and the suffering of 22% of his student population. There might be 1,700 or 17,000 students, but 22% of them are Jewish, and many of them are Zionists. And so the administration does not understand the issue that is plaguing their university. It is systemic moral rot, and they cannot understand that.
Well, thank you for that, and I think that Professor Rickford should be removed from teaching altogether. I mean, this is part of the problem, and then to Mr. Pidluzny, we only have a few seconds left. I agree with you. I think tax-exempt status, federal money flowing in, the endowments getting taxed at such low rates, money, as they say in politics, money talks and BS walks. I think this is really the only way to go with these, and you can confirm that in the last few seconds we have if the chairwoman would indulge us.
Absolutely. I think we need to look for new accountability structures, as many of them as we can. And so looking at the endowment tax is one of those, tax-exempt status is one of those. But other ideas would be to start asking the question, does a university with a $54 billion endowment, does it really need to be eligible for Title IV funding, or can it fund its own students? Similarly, we need to look at moving some of that Title IV funding off of traditional 2- and 4-year campuses so that students who want to spend 15 weeks studying can also access their Pell Grant. We need to change the financial incentive for these corrupt institutions.
I agree 100%. These institutions with these endowments have become about wealth, power, influence, and politics. We know that, and I thank you so much to all of you. I'm sorry I couldn't ask every one of you a question, but thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Ms. Dror, especially for what you've suffered at Cornell. Let's hope we remedy this situation with Professor Bickford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd remind members to try to keep their comments to 5 minutes or less. The chair now recognizes Representative Sanchez for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for providing this committee with another serious opportunity to acknowledge and confront the reality of rising hate in our nation. And I also want to specifically thank our witnesses for being here today and sharing your perspectives, particularly Ms. Dror for sharing your personal experiences. It troubles me that across the country we are seeing a rise in reported hate crimes. Anti-Semitism is just one of the ways that we see groups that are targeted, but there are many other forms of hatred as well, from anti-Asian sentiment to Islamophobia to anti-immigrant rhetoric. We are seeing this rise in very dangerous, in my opinion, speech that I think leads to violence. So I want to be very clear that we cannot allow hate to grow anywhere, but especially here in the United States, and especially at our nation's college campuses and universities. Universities have an obligation under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide all students a school environment that is free of discrimination. But incidences of anti-Semitism, as we heard today, across college campuses are still rising. Universities should be places of knowledge, tolerance, and mutual respect, and there's simply no place for hate on college campuses across the country. We are a multicultural society, and we should be encouraging acceptance and tolerance for every group that is a part of the fabric of the United States. We certainly have to prioritize student safety. Universities need to provide a supportive learning environment for all students. We know that more diverse and inclusive campuses and workplaces foster safer environments for learning and growth. To those that are here today and who have experienced anti-Semitism, you need to know that this committee stands with you, as does the Biden administration, which has focused on combating anti-Semitism in school since releasing a related national strategy last May. The DOJ and the Department of Homeland Security have worked to strengthen coordination with local and campus law enforcement to respond to increasing incidences of hate-driven intimidation and also violence. President Biden's Department of Education has also made very clear that anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism are all prohibited under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So I want to thank the administration for standing so strongly against hate in our schools and across college campuses, because no student should have a fear of attending classes or other on-campus obligations and opportunities. I want to begin by asking the panel about hate speech. I would like to know if any of you think that hate speech is sort of the precursor to violence or can lead to violence. Does anybody disagree with that statement?
I completely agree.
That hate speech, if repeated often enough or increasing in intensity, can lead to violence. Anybody disagree with that?
I think the antidote to the hate speech is more speech, other perspectives, calling it out for what it is.
But the question is, does anybody here believe that hate speech, if repeated often enough and increasing in intensity, does not lead to violence? Okay. Just want to make sure that we have unanimity, because we see rising hate speech in college campuses, and certain groups at certain times in this country have been targets of hate speech. And while it's easy to rush to the defense of your community when your community is under attack, when you hear hate speech that targets any group, we all have an obligation, I think, to stand up and, as you said, Doctor, to combat hate speech, to call it out for what it is, and to correct the record. So it's particularly disappointing when we see leaders, whether they be academics or public servants, using hate speech like the blood of our country is being poisoned by a particular group, or like one particular group of people in this country, they all have AIDS. That's hate speech. And if you repeat the lie often enough and increase in intensity, you are creating the perfect tinder for the catalyst of violence. So again, I just want you to know the committee stands against anti-Semitism. We live in a multicultural society, and we have to all defend each other when that happens. I am sorry for your experiences, and I am here to work with my colleagues to try to help combat that to the degree that we can, and we will look for solutions given the recommendations that you have given us today. Thank you so much for being here, and I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Van Dyne and Ranking Member Schneider, and thank you all for being here today. I am horrified by these acts of anti-Semitism, and I can't really comprehend it. I grew up in the city of Columbus, Ohio, within the city of Bexley, in a very large Jewish population. I went to bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs growing up. There was a girl in my class whose mother had a tattoo on the inside of her arm. I cannot comprehend what is happening today. It's mind-blowing. Ms. Dror, you know it's not easy to be here. You've already done this once. You're doing it again. It can be rather intimidating, but you seem like a very strong young woman, and I'm proud of you. And I commend you for the bravery of standing up for yourself. And of course, congratulations on your graduation. And I'm sorry that you really didn't have the experience of enjoying your senior year and hanging out and looking forward to graduation. Did you have any help from the university planning ahead of where you were going to go with your life in your senior year? Did you have any of that kind of support?
Thank you, Ms. Miller. It's great to see you again, and thank you for your warm wishes. I will say I just graduated and have had a pretty busy year trying to deal with the hatred on my campus. I have sent multiple emails to my university calling out the hate, asking for help, asking them to do something, and I've been met with generic email responses saying, please see the Office of Help and Care and Love and Hugs, and that absolutely will not do it for me. I've also turned to career services for help. And I remember particularly in one meeting, I was working on my resume with a staff member when she told me, by the way, I just want you to know, people might not hire you because of your political involvement. My political involvement is standing against Jews feeling afraid to walk on their campus. If people aren't hiring me, we have a much, much, much bigger problem. That's bigotry.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. And it could be a lot longer than that, honestly. Mr. Marcus, in spite of the instances of physical violence against Jewish students, universities pretty much have still held to inaction, and they're hiding behind free speech as the reasoning for their silence. Violence is not free speech. Violence is not free speech. And many colleges and universities have adopted a policy of what is now called institutional neutrality, which means that the institution won't take a public position on social or political issues unless it threatens the very mission of that school and its values. So, I don't know what to say. Since its creation, it's been adopted by a number of schools across the country. Tell me, what do you think of this policy of institutional neutrality?
Congresswoman Miller, when the principle of institutional neutrality first became popular, I thought it was a fine idea because too many institutions are taking the wrong sides of issues and impairing the environment on their campus by doing so. On the other hand, I noticed that there are many institutions that are now adopting that principle only when they've been asked to condemn terrorist attacks against the Jewish people. Then all of a sudden they say, oh, well, maybe we don't want to have to take a stand, and maybe if we adopt this principle, we will have some sort of cover, some sort of excuse for why we don't do it. And I would say that in those instances, it's not really about neutrality, it's about cowardice and should be called out as such.
You know, I grew up in the 60s, and I experienced protests and the rest. Violence is against the law. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing. It is deeply troubling that we are once again having a hearing to discuss the rise in anti-Semitism across our nation's college campuses. And since our hearing in November, we've seen repeated acts of violence, the development of illegal encampments, and a continued lack of accountability being upheld by so many quote-unquote elite institutions. The rhetoric and actions of students, largely in support of Hamas and in opposition to the ideals of democracy and freedom, have drawn the admiring attention and support of America's enemies. This includes Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Iran has long funded terror groups across the Middle East, including Hamas and including Hezbollah. And on May 29th, Khamenei tweeted, "Dear university students in the United States of America, you are standing on the right side of history." This example from the world's leader of state-sponsored terrorism underscores the threat we face, not only from our enemies seeking to take advantage, but even from within our own nation. I want to start with Professor Davidai. Can you speak to the shift you've seen within our universities to having so many outspoken students be comfortable with their alignment to an autocratic leader who is actively desiring the downfall of these very institutions that they are attending, that they're protesting at, and also wishing physical harm to Americans?
Thank you for this question. I'm really happy to talk about this. We're focused here on anti-Semitism and support for terrorism, but at the heart of it, you can see that this is about anti-Americanism. Just a few examples. Students for Justice in Palestine, the national organization, if you go on their website, it does not acknowledge the United States. It says that they have over 200 chapters across Turtle Island, and then in parentheses it says occupied North America, occupied United States and Canada. We had a professor, Hamid Abishi, described Israel, and I quote, as an outpost of American barbarism. This is a professor at Columbia. We had students celebrating the Houthis, right, the terrorist organization that executes gay men just for being gay, and who this morning shot down a merchant ship, a commercial merchant ship. So it really is an anti-American sentiment that is, like smarter people have said before me, it always starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. And I think the best way to see that is, where do you see American flags? When the pro-Israeli groups rally, you see Israeli flags and American flags. When you see an American flag in these pro-Hamas protests, it's only when it's being burned.
Thank you, sir. I want to quickly move now to discuss school accountability. It's been very troubling to see the reports of faculty groups forming in the mold of Students for Justice in Palestine. And in some instances, these faculty for Justice in Palestine groups are taking part in anti-Semitic efforts of their student counterparts. For example, at the University of Pennsylvania, my own backyard, in Philadelphia, a chapter of FJP blocked the main entrance to an administrative building during a quote-unquote die-in protest, which was a violation of campus policy at that time. I want to ask both Mr. Marcus and Ms. Dror, based on your experiences in this space and familiarity with these campus groups, what actions do you believe school administrators should be taking to address specifically the faculty issue? And have you, Ms. Dror, in your experiences, have you seen instances at Cornell not actively enforcing their stated policies?
Absolutely. I can think of at least 3 different instances in which faculty canceled classes. So students paying for their tuition were denied the right to their education in the name of Palestinian liberation and supporting the encampment. The faculty also got together and published an article in Al Jazeera, Qatari state-funded media. Our faculty, I think today actually, published a large letter with about 250 signees that endorsed terrorism and endorsed all the protests on our campus. I think all faculty need to be terminated if they are promoting anti-American beliefs. Russell Rickford, the faculty member mentioned earlier, was hired after having written that he blames Israel for committing 9/11. So there need to be some serious reforms in the hiring processes of these faculties as well.
Thank you. My time's expired, so Mr. Marcus, if you could submit your answer for the record, that would be great.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for having this hearing today, and our witnesses for your sharing your insights, your patience. I know it's been a long day, but this is a critically important issue. As we've talked about throughout the day, since October 7th, the worst day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, a day when Hamas sent thousands of fighters across the border, terrorists across the border, barbarically murdered, tortured, raped, burned dead bodies, more than 1,200 killed, 250 taken hostage. Since that horrific day, we have seen a spike of anti-Semitism around the world, in the United States, but in particular, we're talking today about what we've seen on campuses. We've mentioned the spike. We've mentioned the fact, I think Mr. Deutch mentioned that 80% of Jewish students on campus have a sense of identity, of connection, of personal closeness to the Jewish state. Not surprisingly, I think the other statistic besides that is that approximately 80% of Jewish students report fear or reluctance or decision not to wear or display outward signs of their Judaism, whether it's wearing a kippah or a Star of David. What I'd like to do, with the chairman's permission, is introduce into the record a document, the American Jewish Committee State of Anti-Semitism in America 2023 Insights and Analysis.
Without objection.
Thank you. We talked earlier in the opening remarks, the sense was part of the reason for this rise in anti-Semitism was weak university leadership, the failure of universities to enforce their policies, of university leaders to make clear, morally clear statements. We've talked about the radical faculty and other things. And throughout this, we've also touched, and I'll add my items to the list, but following the money. It's not just the money that's funding universities. It's the money that's funding these groups like Students for Justice in Palestine. Earlier when I was focusing on faculty, students, and Ms. Dror, I'll pick on you. You made it through in 4 years. Correct?
3.
3, even better.
Yeah.
But over the course of that, freshman students come in, they have to learn their way around, they pick their classes, they get involved with various organizations. Sophomore year, they start thinking about major, junior major, and graduate and go on to pursue their careers. But there is an imbalance as groups like SJP have people who are in their 13th year of their 4-year PhD program, not having completed a single class, but they're there with a purpose and with funding behind it. I think we need to look into that. But I also want to be careful that we don't paint with too broad of a brush. Dr. Pidluzny, you mentioned there are, I think, 70 schools where we had these protests, roughly 3,000 people who have been arrested, but there are 4,000 colleges and universities across this country. Not every university has gotten it wrong. Not every university has been affected by what we've seen on some of the campuses in the news. And we have to be careful that we don't delegitimize differences of opinion, which is what we should see on our universities, the ability to have that debate with each other, with the focus on hate and violence. Hate begets violence. Violence makes our students feel unsafe, and ultimately there will be consequences. Mr. Deutch, I want to turn to you with the minute that's left, but you've been here in Congress, you're at an American Jewish Committee, seeing the challenges being faced across the country. Can you highlight the most important things we should be doing, besides talking about it and putting a spotlight on the hate and violence we're seeing on campus? What actions should we be taking that will have a real difference as we head to the new academic year?
Thank you. Look, I think the conversation about tax exempt status is important. I think the conversation about foreign funding is important. I would add to that, by the way, why not have every student group have to certify that they don't accept foreign funding as well? There are lots of things that are part of this bigger issue that we have to deal with. But right now, there is a train that is barreling down the tracks. Literally, you saw it in New York in a subway car. When people are allowed to get on a subway car and say, where are the Zionists? Are there Zionists here? No Zionists here. This is your chance to get out. That should send a chill down everyone's spine. What Congress can do most, and here's what I've learned since I left. Here's my message to my former colleagues. I say this with enormous respect, and not to just make you feel even better about the job you have. You have enormous power individually, every one of you. And what can you do? Every one of you, yes, the committee should act, and Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to you and to the Speaker for this whole of the House approach, but every one of you can play a role in your community, listening to your Jewish students, listening to the Jewish community. If you don't have a large Jewish community, you can speak out in support of the American values that are at risk when we see what's happening around the country continue to take place. That's what you can do. Expect the universities to take action now in advance of this coming academic year to help protect Jewish students, protect their environment that they operate in, our university system overall, and ultimately our democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for one more second. The video from that train car was horrific, as they said, any Zionist here, any Zionist here. Any Jewish person in that car would have been afraid to stand up. But
not me.
Let me
I would have stood up.
Let me finish, please. But no one else stood up either. It was utter silence, and those people were able to say what they say. We have to speak out, and that's why this hearing is important. We need to stand up. We need to speak out and say, I say proudly as a Jew, but I say as an American, hate has no place in our country. We will stand up and make sure it is defeated. I yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I absolutely agree. We have to be the ones that speak out. It's tragic that we have to have this hearing. It's absolutely tragic. It is 2024, and this should not be happening, and it is appalling. And so you can see as I was listening to Mr. Schneider, I'm getting more and more upset, but I did want to kind of refocus. I know that Mr. Fitzpatrick talked a little bit about FJP and SJP has been mentioned a couple of times. And so I wanted to ask Mr. Marcus, you're obviously familiar with the group. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the group and maybe the role that it's been playing in this explosion of anti-Semitism on campuses?
Congresswoman Fishbach, yes. There is no one single group that's responsible for this entire problem. There are many groups involved, and then there are many wrongdoers who are not part of groups, but SJP is involved far more than any other single individual on many, many campuses, not just in protest, but in various forms of hate as well. On some campuses, their violation of rules or undermining of values has led to their temporary or permanent suspension or expulsion, but they are still active on a large number of universities. They're also active as law students for Justice in Palestine, and now they're also faculty for Justice in Palestine as well. These groups, in addition to having been found responsible for violations of university rules and for their involvement in issues that may create a hostile environment for Jewish students, the toolbook for the national SJP says, among other things, and I'll quote, "We as Palestinian students in exile are part of this movement," meaning the resistance movement, "not merely in solidarity with this movement. We must act as part of this movement." Now, the resistance movement is often understood to include Hamas, known also as the Islamic Resistance Movement. So when an organization of students who says that they are not merely in solidarity, but that they are part of this movement, it raises the question of how they, as an organization, are relating to a U.S. State Department designated terrorist organization and doing it actively on campuses around the United States.
Thank you very much. And Professor, maybe you want to add, and Ms. Dror, I'm going to ask you too, if the response and the evidence we've seen, how did the universities respond to, did they take sufficient or proper response to those organizations?
I can speak about a lot of universities, but the best one that I can is my own, Columbia. Nothing. They have written beautiful emails. It took the president of the university 6 months minus 2 days to acknowledge that Hamas exists. So I've been pleading for them to condemn Hamas. They wouldn't even use the word Hamas in any official email until April 5th. and that was because she was subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress. So if it takes the president of a quote-unquote elite, not elite, but expensive university, to even acknowledge that Hamas is responsible for this, then I'm not surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised, that she and her administration have done absolutely nothing.
Thank you.
I think something worth noting is the double standard. All other groups are subject to policy enforcement, and Students for Justice in Palestine and hate groups on my campus are not. Fraternity Brothers most recently received firm disciplinary action for drinking beer in a backyard with a permit. The Students for Justice in Palestine group had an unauthorized encampment, ruined our entire quad, the entire lawn needed to be redone, and did not receive any actual enforcement on that. In fact, they received complete immunity and a thank you letter from our university.
Well, and I just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you for standing up, because you're doing something courageous by being here too. And I appreciate it, and I, for one, I will say, I will stand with you, because this is, it's appalling that we are dealing with this in 2024, and I thank you for being here, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you
very much.
I want to submit to the record, actually, an article that was just brought to my attention at Columbia University. The title is "Columbia Administrators Fire Off Hostile and Dismissive Text Messages, Vomit Emojis During Alumni Reunion Panel on Jewish Life." The administrators that's listed in this include the Dean of Columbia College, the Vice Dean and Chief Administrator Officer of Columbia College, the Dean of Undergraduate Student Life, and the Associate Dean for Student and Family Support. Without objection, I submit it to the record.
Mr. Chair, may I comment on that article for 1 second?
Yes, please.
One thing to note in that article is not just their ridiculing of everything that's going on, but the fact that as a panel of Jewish individuals were speaking about the problems of anti-Semitism, these administrators use an anti-Semitic trope saying that this Jewish person is using this moment for fundraising. So it's not just cowardness, it's callousness.
It's terrible. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Much of what I have prepared and want to say has largely been said. So there will be some repetition in what I communicate in my few minutes here. But I'm gonna pose one question, and to all of you, and to the extent we have time, we're open to hear from any of you about, like, what can we do to change this trajectory right now? I've talked to folks, particularly someone that went to a university that would have been tied up into this, into what I view as just complete lawlessness and nonsense, that went onto our campuses, and she was telling me the story about, like, you know, we actually had a case study. We talked about this region. We understood the plight of both the Jewish state as well as the Palestinian state and the Palestinians, and I've actually been to Ramallah. I met with folks that run the banking system there, and individual and Palestinians, and the difficulties they have for what their future looks like. I mean, and she's like, we went through a case study. It was one of the most enlightening things that I experienced. That's what our college campuses should be doing. What we saw recently with these encampments and the lawlessness that takes place is the exact opposite of what we need to experience on our college campus. So my question to you all is, what can we do to actually, you know, change the trajectory of the way our universities are going when difficult things come up? There has been probably very, very few things that have been as emotional for me in my time in Congress than to be, and I'm not we're nowhere near close to it, but seeing what took place on October 7th is probably one of the most emotional things that's happened to me. There's a father of 4. He jumped on a grenade to save his boys. I have 4 boys about that same age. Like, I didn't know something that could happen so far away, even though I've been to those kibbutzes where it took place. And then to know this was ultimately the plan. This is Iran's plan all along. They want the public sentiment to change on Israel. And they want what's going on to actually have happen. I wish students could understand the big picture, and how do we get back to being able to communicate it. I'll mention one thing, and that's especially now that my colleague, Mr. Schneider's here. I've never been, as emotional as that was, I've been more proud of any work that we've done, that in the aftermath of that, Mr. Schneider and my colleague, Mr. Panetta, and I have led numerous efforts to make sure that we support and find ways for the conflict that's going to be going on in Gaza to find ways out and to help the humanitarian effort. Hosting the State Department, the three of us have done yeoman's work on figuring this out. And so we're all trying to deal with it. It's a difficult situation. It's tragic. Let me pose that question. Mr. Marcus, I would love to start with you. Just like, what can we do? Do university presidents have to really crack down, or what can we be doing to improve the way we communicate our dialogue and be able to get our dialogue out there so people actually learn instead of just chaos?
Congressman Moore, over this summer, the best of our college administrators are working around the clock to tighten up their policies on conduct, protest, and the like, while the worst of our administrators are ignoring this and allowing things to worsen. Frankly, they will all likely fail if they only look at policies and don't look more deeply at what is leading to this cultural problem. Why is it that universities that should be a source of light and tolerance have become the opposite? That is systemic, and it goes beyond policies and to how they build their faculty, their curriculum, their student body, et cetera.
Doctor, I'll welcome you.
So on this particular issue, I think we have to acknowledge that there's been a concerted effort to change the way Israel is taught about and how the region is taught about going back to the 1970s. The reason for those gifts was to change the way elite universities teach about the region. The New York Times, if you read the New York Times from the 1970s and the 1980s, there are a lot of stories about alarm about the money coming in. And so I think the money needs to be shut off, and I think we need to bring viewpoint diversity to our public affairs disciplines.
Professor.
5 things that I think every university should do. 1, permanently ban every pro-terror student organization. Suspensions are a slap on the wrist that it does nothing. 2, expel the leaders. They know who the leaders of these organizations are. Most of the students protesting are good people, but the leaders need to be held accountable. 3, every one of these organizations has a faculty advisor. Those faculty advisors should be sanctioned and maybe fired. 4, every faculty that supports terrorism, that openly celebrates Hamas, Islamic Jihad, should not be allowed to interact with undergraduates, graduates, any student. They can still have their job, but they're not allowed to be with any students. And 5, every university should adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. If it's good enough for the US Congress, if it's good enough for the President of the United States, it should be good enough for the President of Columbia.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman. Now you're back.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses, and of course, Mr. Deutch. It's always good to see you. As I told you prior to your leaving, you are one of those members that we miss. So thank you for being here today in this capacity especially. I think we can all agree that all students deserve a safe place to learn, free from hate, speech, and discrimination. And I think we understand that free speech and protests, though, are part of university life. However, when protests turn violent, demonstrators break the law, our debates devolve into hate speech, actions need to be taken. What I think is an issue, though, is that when it comes to policies to govern protests and speech on campuses, there are just different standards and difficult standards to meet. When it comes to the First Amendment, there are different policies for public universities which are bound by the First Amendment and private universities which are not. 2, also, we know that to receive federal funds, colleges must adhere to the Civil Rights Act, but that bar to prove discrimination in court is very high. And another issue is that universities have enforced their rules unevenly, as many of you have discussed today. We've seen college administrators curtail speech in certain areas to accommodate students, even for some microaggressions, yet the same administrators appear unmoved by the distress of Jewish students. And sure, all colleges have limits on time, place, and manner of protest so students can attend class, but they are implemented differently. We know that there are examples of universities getting this right by addressing anti-Semitic actions while shutting down protests that endanger the campus community. I saw that in my district at a local university, and it was even written about by a student. who wanted to get to class and appreciated the university's actions to clear the protest. Now, unfortunately, though, some of these positive examples are overshadowed by the missteps of others. When university administrators have taken action against demonstrations, they've been accused for going too far as well. Moreover, heavy-handed policing can galvanize protesters and prove counterproductive. Despite that, though, we should ensure that the positive examples are followed and that we have mechanisms in place to support Jewish students and address and prevent anti-Semitic incidents on campus. Look, we can agree that colleges should protect the rights of students to raise their hands in class in which they can make claims about the Jewish state or even express misguided support for a terrorist organization, because the airing of bad ideas is an important part, not just of college life, but of American life. But letting protesters yell intifada and intimidating Jewish students trying to get to class is not consistent with free speech. Nor is there a free speech right to occupy parts of a university. And yes, we support freedom of assembly as part of the First Amendment, but that does not mean that protesters have a right to assemble anywhere if it means that it prevents other people from using public spaces. And of course, damaging property and defacing statutes is a crime whether you are on campus or in a public park. So if there are lawbreakers that are practicing civil disobedience, they need to do it in a way, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, do it openly, do it lovingly, but doing with the willingness to accept the penalty. Now look, all of you have expressed disappointment in your testimony about the responses from colleges on this issue. We can condemn anti-Semitic speech from students. However, it is ultimately the university leaders to protect students on campus. Now, Mr. Deutch, you talked with my colleagues' questions about what Congress can do. What should universities be doing to address some of these issues that I talked about so that we can prepare for the coming school year to ensure that basically, yes, we protect free speech, but we also crack down on hate speech?
Well, first of all, it's good to see you, Congressman, and thank you for your very thoughtful comments. It starts with acknowledging that universities have the primary responsibility here, that as they're looking ahead to the fall, they're taking action like we've seen at other universities, where, number one, they're speaking out with moral clarity about what is and isn't acceptable, about, as Professor Davidai points out, there can be no tolerance for the support of terrorism on campus. This has been a really interesting conversation. In real life, on college campuses, there are students who are actively speaking out in support of the terrorists who committed the 10/7 atrocity. They should be speaking with more clarity. They should be making sure that the code of student conduct on their campus has been updated to reflect the moment. It should be clear what the repercussions are if it's violated. They should make every student acknowledge what those repercussions are. We've heard this earlier, so that it's clear what will happen, and then they need to actually follow through if the code of student conduct is violated. Those are all important steps that they should be putting in place right now before a single student comes back to campus to set a tone for what is and isn't acceptable, to create the kind of university community that every university president claims that they want.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Van Dyne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I request an unanimous consent to insert for the record a campus-wide email that Cornell President Martha Pollack sent on May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to read a short excerpt from it. Dear Cornellians, last evening the Coalition for Mutual Liberation voluntarily took down their encampment on the Arts Quad. While I do not condone the encampment, which was in clear violation of university policies, I want to acknowledge and express gratitude that, in contrast to what has taken place at some other universities, the participants here remained peaceful and nonviolent throughout, and for the most part, they tried to minimize the disruption caused. With this in mind, and provided no further violations of university policy occur, we are able to pause on issuing additional suspensions and disciplinary referrals. The participants in the encampment shared that members of our Jewish community who have criticized Israel have been targeted with slurs, which not only is deeply offensive, but also trivializes the memory of the Holocaust. Other students involved in the encampment shared experiences of being called terrorists over the past few months in an expression of anti-Arab discrimination and hatred. No matter one's political beliefs, using such rhetoric which questions the basis of someone's religious, cultural, ancestral, or any form of identity is unacceptable. And I implore everyone in our community to think carefully about their words." End quote. It's disappointing that after the chaos and the distress that were caused by mobs of students who set up illegal encampments that raged with anti-Semitism across the country, and Ms. Dror, you described this as anything but peaceful and non-disruptive. But it's disappointing that one of President Martha Pollock's last acts as the president of Cornell University is to express concern that a single student in the encampment says that they were called a slur after Jewish students on Cornell's campus feared for their lives after numerous death threats and harassment that raged for months without end. Ms. Dror, I want to thank you again for taking the time to testify before this committee. Can you please share with us how you felt when you received this email, and how did you feel when you read that the president of your university said that the encampment participants here remain peaceful and nonviolent?
Congresswoman, it's great to see you, and I really appreciate this question because this email was actually the moment I decided not to attend my graduation. This is laughable. I've spent the past 8 months being called a Nazi because I believe in the existence of the state of Israel. And for her to protect students, falsely mischaracterizing Israel defending itself as a genocide in the name of trivializing the Holocaust is laughable and shameful. I also want to bring up a point that you mentioned in that email. She said, a Jewish student that criticized Israel. No, these students call for the complete elimination of the Jewish state and every single Jew inside of it. They are calling for a Jewish genocide. Also, she mentioned that these students have been referred to on campus as terrorists. These students are openly supporting the PFLP, Hamas, and Hezbollah. They are also regularly terrorizing Jewish students on campus by threatening them and intimidating them. It's no surprise that Martha Pollock protects the students behind the encampment when $1.8 billion are funneled into Cornell by United States adversaries.
I appreciate your comments. We've had a lot of discussion now about some of the lack of actions that were taken against not just the students, but other faculty. And you mentioned specifically Russell Rickford. I understand that he was on paid leave. I also understand that he's coming back to campus to teach next semester. Your comments on how to handle that is quite clear. And I think as a committee, looking at universities and whether or not they are teaching anti-American hate, whether they are teaching things that are specifically aimed at creating distrust, division, violent outbursts that are being promoted by their own professors, their own administration, I think that's something that we have to take seriously. Whether or not that's on campus or off campus, if they are putting out stories, if they are putting out articles, yes, while that may not have been written on campus, it does say a lot and it does reflect a lot on the university. And whether or not these universities are actually upholding a pro-America position, and yet they're getting taxpayer-funded dollars, and they're also getting tax-exempt status. And I know that this is something that the chairman takes seriously, has spent a lot of time looking into, and that as a committee we're going to continue to look into. So again, thank you very much, and I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to congratulate you, Ms. Dror, on graduating. I had 3 kids that graduated this year. So it's awesome. It's awesome. And I wish you the best as you move forward in your life. I was on faculty at Dordt University, one of my local universities near my hometown. And being on faculty meant that I was responsible for the students there, that I was responsible for their safety, I was responsible for what they learned, and we could debate, we could argue, but at the end of the day, it was, we do it in a safe environment. And that's what's so disappointing about this, is that we have a failure by tax-exempt universities to provide and enforce discipline on students that are found to violate the basic rules of their institution. So as a committee on Ways and Means, we must look at our responsibility, right? We can always talk about the universities. I get it. Universities have a tremendous amount of responsibility. Their board of trustees got to do things. We just talked all about that. But we have the obligation to decide whether an organization is tax exempt or not. Bottom line, that's our job. And you start looking at Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, okay? Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, if a complaint is investigated, and we can talk about this shortly, Mr. Marcus, because I want to know about this, but if a violation is made, to me, there's got to be a solution that it never happens again. And the solution to me is losing your tax-exempt status. I mean, frankly, this happens in business. In business, if you violate a certain status, or if you're tax-exempt, if you're a nonprofit, all right, you get your tax-exempt pulled away. That's the same thing that should happen here. So I want to ask each one of you, Ms. Dror, what do you think about this? I mean, do you think the federal government should act in this purpose? Because to me, if you pull away their tax-exempt status, things change very quickly. Trust me, they will change. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, Chairman Smith's investigation into these universities have finally gotten them to act. That is the only thing that is pushing them to act.
Yes, yes. Professor, what do you think?
I completely agree with your assessment. The only thing that I would say is there is no difference between college campuses and the House Committee, because they are training your future colleagues. So if you don't act now, your future colleagues will not let you act when they get to Congress.
Well said. 100% agree. Doctor?
So the Department of Education should issue findings that these universities are not doing anything to ensure that Jewish students have access to the education that Title VI guarantees them. And at that point, if it should make real demands, right? It should say, audit your foreign gifts, audit your academic programs for anti-Israel bias, enforce your policies, take a hard look at how you're socializing international students to the norms and expectations of the campus. And if the universities do not comply with those expectations, then it's time to begin an administrative proceeding to end their access to Title IV aid. I also think it's time to start talking very seriously about raising endowment taxes and about ending the tax-exempt status.
Yep. And you sit on the OCR, you have.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear what you have to say on this.
So, Congressman Fenstra, it is rare that a university is adjudicated liable for violation.
And why is that?
It's difficult and expensive to get to that point. It's also rare that OCR has formal findings of a violation against a university. If universities knew that a formal finding or adjudication under Title VI could jeopardize their tax funds, you would see them respond much more forcefully to credible allegations.
Yes, thank you. Finally.
Thank you, Congressman. Look, I want to just use this as an opportunity to thank you and urge the committee to keep at this in a bipartisan way. This is not a partisan issue. No. We should be looking at every possible way to get universities to ensure that they're living up to their own ideals. And if this is a way to start that conversation and get them there, then we ought to be having that conversation.
You know what? When you affect the pocketbook, it makes a difference. Then people respond. And it's a tragedy that's what it takes, but it is. And these board of trustees, the only way they're going to learn is you take away their tax-exempt status. And it starts with Title VI in the Civil Rights Act. And it starts with using the Office of Civil Rights to start finding these schools and what they're doing and go after them. So thank you for each one of you for being witnesses. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you all for hanging in for more than 3 hours for this as we come and go. I'm very concerned about it. I think all of us here in a bipartisan way are concerned about it. I was disappointed that not a single Republican joined Senator Congressman Castan's appropriations letter to ensure that the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights had the funding it needed to pursue actual anti-Semitic crimes on college campuses. You know, we've been working on this in Congress for a long time. The current rise in hate crimes, deeply disappointing. According to the most recent hate crime statistics to data from the FBI, race-based crimes reached the highest level ever recorded in 21 and 22. But anti-Semitic hate crimes rose a whopping 36% from 2021 to 2022. But one of the key things we know about hate crimes is that they are also dramatically, drastically underreported. So that we know that even from this limited data, we're not getting the full picture. Mr. Olson, Mr. Upton, Mr. Buchanan, all three Republicans, and I partnered with Judy Chu to successfully pass the Jabira Hire No Hate Act. And that was to better support law enforcement to report and respond to hate crimes and set up state hate crime hotlines so that people who didn't feel comfortable going to the police station called them in. And while that bill is meaningful, we were very proud of it, it signed into law, and yet the reporting of the incidents has gotten worse. It has not improved at all. And at a time when reporting has gotten worse, FBI Director Wray was here in the fall to tell us that crimes towards Jews are reaching historic levels. I introduced a bill recently with Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska, the Improving Reporting to Prevent Hate Act. And I would love to have all my Republicans join me on this. It set up a process where DOJ evaluates jurisdictions with over 100,000 citizens to make certain that they are credibly reporting hate crimes. The goal is to ensure that we have a better handle on where these anti-Semitic incidents are occurring, how we can better track and address and prevent them. And Honorable Mr. Deutch, welcome back. Can you speak about how a bill like this would be an asset in addressing the anti-Semitic crimes?
There's, as we've talked about over the course of this hearing, it's important for us to be able to really tackle anti-Semitism, for us to follow through and hold people accountable and hold universities accountable. We need more funding for the Office of Civil Rights so that they can do it. Likewise, the reason that the Jabara Hire No Hate Act was so important, and I applaud your leadership on that, Mr. Beyer, is because we want to be able to be sure that we're identifying the hate crimes, particularly as we see this spike in anti-Semitism, and especially when we know that anti-Semitic hate crimes are often underreported. And the way to do that is to ensure that there is adequate funding to help get us there. So I applaud your efforts continuing to focus on that. I think it's an important way for us to move forward.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, this late hour, I yield back.
In Missouri, this is still very early. Ms. Maliatakis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all believe it's unfortunate that we need to be here, and nobody thought in 2024 we would be dealing with this immense spike in anti-Semitism in our country, but it is so critical that we are here together as Republicans and Democrats trying to find the best solutions to stop this. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here. Certainly, Ms. Talia Dror, thank you. You're a student in New York State. I represent New York State, so I want to thank you for being here, not only once, but twice, because that takes tremendous amount of courage for you to come here. And I congratulate you on your graduation, and I'm sorry that you had to miss the ceremony. Since the horrific attacks on October 7th of last year by Hamas on Israel, the ugly face of anti-Semitism has showed on college campuses across the country. Instead of preparing our young people for life and getting them ready to be productive members of a civilized society, campuses have turned into indoctrination centers of hate. It seems to be getting worse to me. Maybe it's because I'm in New York City. And in the news, sadly, we've seen anti-Semites boldly flying the flags of Hamas, of Hezbollah, terrorist organizations. In my city, we've also seen a terrible display of a sign saying "Long live October 7th" at a memorial that was dedicated to the victims of the Nova Music Festival. We've seen vandalism of homes of the Jewish board members of the Brooklyn Museum. And we've also seen, as you mentioned, Mr. Deutch, the bullying of Zionists or pro-Israel individuals on the subway system, completely unacceptable. It starts with education. It starts with the classroom. I think we need to work together. But I have introduced two bills I just want to mention briefly. I have H.R. 7231, which is the Campus Act, and this legislation would prohibit universities that have been found to promote anti-Semitic activities or allow them, or that are protecting anti-Semitic faculty from receiving federal funding. I think it's a good bill. I think it's something that would really maybe make a difference in pushing these university presidents to hold faculty or these student organizations accountable. Professor, I know you're also from New York City. I would love to hear your view if you support a measure like that and if you think it would be effective.
Well, to be honest, being a professor, I cannot comment on something I don't know all the details of. But as a fellow New Yorker, we have to remember anti-Jewish crime is the #1 hate crime in New York City for the past 7 years in a row. This is a spike, but this is not new. And this has been under the current Mayor Eric Adams' administration, and it has been under the previous administrations. The biggest Jewish population of the U.S. is in New York City, and nothing has been done.
It's getting worse. It's getting worse.
Unfortunately, hopefully this will stop it, but yeah.
Doctor, I would like to ask you, I have another bill, H.R. 7232, No Visas for Anti-Semitic Students Act, that would revoke the visa of foreign students in the United States who are members of these organizations and participating in this activity. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, our view is that there are 4 grounds of inadmissibility that have been triggered in some cases. Right? So DHS already has this authority to look at these protests and try to understand which of the students have espoused support or given support for terrorism, which of the students have committed crimes involving moral turpitude, any who lied in their visa application. And so I applaud your leadership from Congress, but I think the administration could take these actions itself if it wanted to.
Okay. Well, perhaps this legislation would give them a little more teeth to do it. And Ms. Dror, would you agree with something like that? You think that we should be stripping visas from, whether it's my bill or whether it's the administration doing it, should we be stripping visas from foreign students who are committing anti-Semitic activity on our campuses?
Absolutely. The leader of the Coalition for Mutual Liberation, Cornell's program, or Cornell's organization, is on a student visa. He should get that student visa revoked yesterday.
It's a perfect example, Doctor. It's obviously not happening at the administration level. Hopefully we can push them with new legislation. Mr. Deutch, you're obviously a subject matter expert on these issues as a member of Congress formerly. We'd love to talk to you about education. What can we do more to educate young people about the Holocaust, about the history of Israel? We have a Jewish student here who was called a Nazi by a fellow student. It's outrageous, simply because she supports Israel. Social media misinformation. You know, these students that are doing this, they're actually proud to have the endorsement of Hamas and Iran. What can we do to educate young people, both at the state level and the national level?
I can answer that in 10 seconds. It's good to see you again, Congresswoman. Look, you touched on each of the key pieces. One, on social media.